Metal Warriors on the Super Nintendo. This was a game developed by LucasArts, I wish they were still around, and published by Konami back when their logo was 2 strips of bacon, and they weren't one of the worst companies to just abuse their IPs ever. Basically, the 90s were an infinitely better time than the time we live in today, and I wish we could go back there. But Metal Warriors is, at its core, an interesting evolution of the Assault Suit series. That's kind of the best comparison I could give for it. If you're not familiar, the Assault Suit series was a series of 2D scrolling platformer shooting games where you pilot a mech around. Not quite run and gun because they were slower because you were in a plodding mech, but still, you get that kind of vibe when you play this game. It's a 2D shooty mech thing that's a lot of fun, but it takes it in kind of a new direction with some simple mechanic tweaks. The story follows, I think your character's name is Stone? I actually don't know, because before I started playing this, I went to the options menu and saw an option that lets you change your character's name. I don't know how many people who've played this game actually know that. But you can basically insert yourself into the story. Speaking of the options menu, it has like this tiny little level that lets you test all the mechs and stuff, and I gotta say, like, the first half hour of me playing this was just messing around in that little test environment. It was a ton of fun. The options in this game, great. Anyway, you are the leader of a ragtag assault squadron of mech pilots trying to regain the Irath and ultimately overthrow the forces of Axis. So basically, it's the plot of Double Zeta Gundam, but far more serious and less goofy. So, you know, it's better Double Zeta Gundam is the point I'm trying to make here. The story itself has some interesting turns as it plays out, and you get some really nice cutscenes as it goes on. And what's really cool is you actually get a little bit of character development as you play. And when I say little, I mean very little, but like in every cutscene you get like a promotion, and they will actively change your title as you go. Really nice little touch. And the overall presentation of the story itself is really quite breathtaking. I think story-wise, you know, for an action game, it's impressive in all regards. Although I will say there is a little bit of repetition here and there. They reuse a lot of scenes and music from these. Still, you know, I think they did a really great job. The gameplay to Metal Warriors is really well done, although it's not without its issues, I've found. Like I said, it's sort of the Assault Suit vein. If you've played them, you've got a good idea of what this does, although it has some unique mechanics as well. You pilot your mech trying to basically destroy anything in your way to ultimately complete your objectives. But what really struck me about this level-wise was on 2 fronts. First of all, was the fact that every stage I played sort of had a different feel about it, like in terms of goals. Like your first level is as simple, destroy everything in your way, get to the end. And then there was a level where you had to hijack a brand new experimental mech. There was a defensive mission as well, and while I don't particularly care for those, it does show the range and versatility of the level design. You don't run into a lot of levels that feel all that similar in terms of overall scope and objective, and that keeps things fresh, for sure. The second thing that really impressed me about the levels, though, was not just the variety of mission objectives from the start, but that they were fluid and not necessarily static. And what I mean by that was, on level, I think it was 3, you start by going in and trying to destroy everything in your way and get to the end, basically. Same as level 1. But when you get there, suddenly it becomes a thing where you have to, you know, capture this base. And once you do, suddenly you have to defend it. And before it's over, you have to then go and take care of the people who are trying to invade and capture their ship. So it goes from an offensive assault to a defensive mission to a capture mission. And it was really interesting that it didn't have the levels stay in a sort of predefined state. It went through stages that completely changed what you had to do about it, which is great. I also noticed that the stages themselves have a destructible environment to them. Like, you're constantly required to just destroy walls to get through stuff. And while each stage isn't like entirely destructible by any means, the fact that you're constantly destroying the environment and reshaping it in order to carve a path forward is really, really cool. And sometimes some unexpected environmental stuff will do it for you. I remember running around underground and then suddenly like there's this huge rock slide and I was collapsed below with like several enemies trained with their guns on me, and it was like, whoa, that was a really impactful moment. There are some really cool set pieces that really play with the destructible environments here. And the fact that this game has such thorough destructible environments is very, very impressive. Now, as I've said a couple times at this point, this game does something slightly different from at least my experience with the Assault Suit series, and that is one very small mechanic that changes the dynamic of this game entirely. And that is, in this game about sort of 2D mech simulation, you gotta get out of your mech. There are points in this game where it requires you to step out of your mech and go and activate switches and buttons and capture things and basically open doors and whatever. And it feels kind of like, what was that NES game, Metal Mech? I've never played it, but it kind of reminds me of that. I really want to try though. But when you hop out of your mech, it adds a completely new dynamic to the game because, and I feel like this is obvious, if you're not in a giant mechanized suit of armor, you're kind of really unbelievably fragile. You can take 4 or 5 shots from another guy running around on the ground, but if a mech trains their sights on you, you're basically dead. Now on the bright side, larger turrets, traps, and things tend to not lock onto you and actively antagonize you, but there are exceptions. And the game likes to play around with that idea. I remember running into one enemy on a stage that was actively trained on my little pilot guy, but I had to get past him in order to activate a switch to get back in my mech. And the thing is, while you do have a gun, your gun is actually pretty ineffective to basically everything. Weirdly enough, enemy pilot guys running around, they can actually damage mechs with their little pea shooter and grenades. You don't have that luxury, and that, unfortunately, leads us to a bit of a problem. This is one of my bigger issues with this game, and that is, while you can get out of your mech, and you need to, both for plot, but also to survive because your mech's gonna explode or whatever, there's only so many mechs in each stage, and they're predefined. So if you happen to hop out of all your mechs because they're about to blow up, because, you know, you handled an encounter incredibly badly, well, you're kind of stuck, because as your little pilot guy, your guns do not do damage to bigger turrets and other obstacles. You need your mech for that. And those could basically soft lock you right there, because your only other solution in situations like this, again, as far as I was able to tell, because I couldn't respawn new mechs or anything, or hijack enemy mechs that are currently in use, that would have been a cool feature, was to hop back in my mech that was about to explode and hope they don't shoot me one last time and kill me, because otherwise I was just stuck there doing nothing. And sure, there are repair kits that will help you repair your mech in these situations, but you can just feel like you're in a totally hopeless situation with no real solution sometimes. And I don't care for that so much. Even if your little crappy pilot gun were to do minimal damage to enemy mechs or something, just so that you could continue advancing even against all odds, would have felt like a little bit more player forgiving than if you just happen to use your mech the wrong way. Because, and this leads to another mechanic I really like about this game versus the Assault Suit games, there are multiple mechs. I think there's something like 6, and each one of them has different situational value and strategy that accompanies it. Your starting mech is kind of an all-roundy melee type with a decent gun, and then you can find another one that's sort of like that but built more for close range encounters. Kind of reminded me a little bit of the Camphor from Gundam. Then you can find one that has like these giant cannons, and it's like this huge artillery unit with flamethrowers, but it can't jump. And this guy actually gave me a little bit of trouble because I had him on the level where you need to like hop onto an enemy ship to capture it, and I couldn't figure out how to do that. Again, I thought I was kind of soft locked. Fortunately, you can just create blocks in front of you and walk over, but it's very slow, it's very, very plodding, and it's definitely a very situational mech. Likewise, there's a mech that turns into a little ball and Sonic the Mech Hog spin dashes all over the place, and then turns into like a little turret to shoot stuff. There's a lot of mechs in this game, and they all have their own unique functions and their own situational value, and they all play completely differently, which means that whenever you find them, your strategy needs to kind of evolve on the fly as you play, because it's a new resource that will behave differently than your current resource, although it might have more health. It's really cool to see different mechs in this sort of style of game that allow you to swap out how you play on the fly, and change how you play based on necessity. And in a bit of like evil turnabout, if you leave your mech alone, sometimes enemy pilots running around will actually hop in and hijack it, which can be a huge problem. Another thing I really liked about this game, especially when it comes to the mechs, and especially regarding damage to them, was the fact that there's a great sense of object permanence in this game. Basically, if I was running around and I seriously damaged my mech at like the very start of the game, I could abandon it, run to the end of the game, find a brand new mech, and if I destroyed that, I could run all the way back to the start. My mech would still be there, where I left it with as much damage as I had left it in. That is unbelievable. I really have to give them credit for the sense of continuity in their own stages and how the game keeps track of everything. It's very technologically impressive. I can't think of a ton of games that did that, certainly in the scope of the levels this game has. And while stuff like object permanence isn't exactly a stranger to games in the Super Nintendo era, I mean, hell, the first Super Nintendo game ever, Super Mario World, has it. You can just abandon Yoshi and come back and there he'll be, sitting there. You know, the fact that this game does it over the scope and scale of each of these levels and remembers the exact amount of health your mech has is impressive. Even, you know, if I wish it healed over time so I wouldn't feel like I had no mech and I had to restart the stage. Did I mention this game's kind of hard? Because yeah, it gets a little bit hard, especially starting around level 4. I'm not going to say this game has like a huge difficulty spike, but it definitely ramps things up pretty hard. I don't think that most people will be able to beat this their first time over, and considering that there's a special stage you can only access if you play without dying, you know, it's going to take some effort and some repetition to really understand how to beat these levels efficiently in order to see it all. It's a little beginner unfriendly, especially if you're still getting used to the controls, because the controls are a little bit awkward. Like, don't get me wrong, all the buttons do what you need it to do, and, you know, you've got one button that maps the melee attack, you've got the shoulder buttons that map your power-up weapons that you pick up every now and then, you've got your gun attack, you've got, like, a dash, you've got a shield. Some mechs have 2 shields, one that's deployable, which is cool, but just in general, the aiming is really kind of awkward. Basically, you have to aim by pressing up and down on the control stick. Left and right moves you forward and back, of course, but in order to actually hit things above or below you, anything that you're not immediately trained on when you start, you're going to press up and down to sort of aim at, and it really does feel fairly awkward, at least initially. I think that the best way to play this game kind of requires you to modify your aiming while you're hiding behind a shield, and that took a lot of time for me to kind of wrap my head around. It just didn't feel really natural to me. Again, this game doesn't have a lot of issues, but it's definitely a bit of a problem that you're going to have to overcome in order to play this game well. And the later levels do get a fair bit longer than the earlier ones, and they don't have anywhere near as much healing. Although, to be fair, the earlier stages give you unlimited healing, which is more than a little overkill. Basically, when you get to the later levels, the issue about running out of health for your mech, or just the idea of hopping out of your mech and having problems like finding a way to progress because your mech's too damaged and there's not really another one to hop into, really magnify. Metal Warriors is not a perfect game gameplay-wise. It has its issues, but at its core, it's still a fun mech-y shooter with a remarkable amount of variance in its mission design. I was thoroughly impressed playing this, and every stage felt different on a fundamental level, and the set pieces in those levels kept it very, very fresh. While I do have issues with this game, I think gameplay-wise, it's still an excellent experience. It might take a little bit of getting used to get past the controls, and it'll take a couple playthroughs to, you know, get good enough to actually beat the game, but I think this game is definitely a ton of fun, but it is worth knowing that it does have its flaws. In terms of presentation, Metal Warriors is pretty solid, although it does have a few stumbling blocks. Visually, it's really quite good. I quite enjoy the fact that in gameplay, your mech has a visual health indicator as opposed to a health bar that would clutter the screen. When you first get into your mech, it'll be basically bright red, and as you take more and more damage, it will dull to a gray, and then it will start sparking and then eventually explode. It's nice that it does have that visual indicator and doesn't clutter the screen with a health bar. It just keeps the game with a nice, clean presentation. The sprite art is beautiful, especially in the cutscenes, and the individual mechs have like these really nice profile pics I've seen. They're very, very beautiful, and I have to admit, I do love the sprite art in this game. Someone put a lot of time and effort into it. Although I will say that once again, the cutscenes do reuse a lot of animation. That does feel a little bit cheap, but given that they put so much effort into everything else, I'm more than willing to let that slide. Audio-wise, I don't think this game is quite as good as it is visually. I think the soundtrack is above average. It's got some rather good songs, although nothing super memorable. And it does have a neat little voiced line when you get really low health. It tells you warning, and then, like, you know, just just to tell you that your mech's about to explode. That's a nice little touch. In terms of sound effects though, it feels a little bit unimpressive. I think the sound effects overall could have a lot more punch to them and impact to make it feel like you're, you know, in a giant destructible mech that's like blowing up the world around you, and yet it just doesn't quite feel that way, you know? I think the soundscape for your weapons and sound effects could be a lot more impactful, and doing so would really impart a sense of power, and unfortunately that is the one real stumbling block presentation-wise with this game. Otherwise, it is excellent. Now, if you want a copy of Metal Warriors on the Super Nintendo, the cheapest authentic copy I can see on eBay is an unbelievable $450 with shipping. Wow, that is really expensive. I knew this game was going to be up there in price, which is why I'm incredibly thankful that Jet Wolf sent me a copy of this. Fortunately, you know, reproductions do exist, and that would be a lot less expensive, but if you want an authentic copy, you're going to be spending an absolute mint on this game. And while I do like this game, and it's definitely one I've wanted to play for a long time, I'm not sure I would say it's that good. I certainly do have my own personal threshold for how much you should pay for a retro game based on how much you want it, but this one is definitely beyond what I would recommend. Maybe $100, maybe, but I don't think this is worth the $450. That said, I do like it a lot more than like the one Assault Suit game I've played, which was Cybernator, and I do like it more than the sort of knockoff Assault Suit game I played, which was the Front Mission game on the Super Nintendo, Gun Hazard I think it was called. Both excellent games as well, but I think if we're talking about Super Nintendo 2D mech shooty action, I'm inclined to give it to Metal Warriors as the best one. Although Front Mission Gun Hazard is pretty cool in its own right, and it has like a story and like a lot of stuff. I'm gonna have to talk about that game eventually, but I think Metal Warriors is probably the best out of like the three similar style games I've played on the Super Nintendo, even though I think it's possibly also the roughest in some regards, just in terms of how the levels are structured and the fact that if you lose a mech, while you can continue ostensibly, you might basically be soft locked, or at least as far as I could tell you were. I could not find another way to get more mechs if I lost one, you know? And there's not really a way to destroy certain obstacles if you don't have a mech, so you are effectively stuck. And it's really that one thing that makes me not want to actively recommend this game if you could get it at a decent price, because I find that really frustrating. It's the one thing I can't really look past in this game. And it's a shame because Metal Warriors is, at its core, a really great game and a great evolution of the Assault Suit style games. It's certainly the most memorable out of all the Assault Suit style games I've played, with your ability to swap mechs and for each one to have a completely different profile for exploring the environment, you know, and the fact that the missions are so different makes me really want to recommend this. But it's unbelievably expensive, and I just can't recommend it at that price. At a better price, I would still probably recommend Gun Hazard over Metal Warriors, just in terms of a more consistently good experience, at least based on my memories of it. But Metal Warriors is still a very interesting game, and it's definitely one that's there for the collectors. I mean, just looking at that price anyway. But again, I have to give a huge shout out and thank you to Jet Wolf for sending this to me. This is one I've wanted for a very long time, and getting to play it was a bit of a dream come true for me. It's very, very good, but it's not perfect. But if you like Assault Suit, this one might be worth looking into, provided you can afford it. I think that it's certainly a fun mech-style game on the Super Nintendo, and that was a console that had a couple, but honestly, out of all of them, this one might be the most noteworthy to me. Overall, Metal Warriors is not a perfect game. It's a flawed game, but it's a lot of fun. And, you know, it reminds me of LucasArts, a company I wish was still around that made a lot of really good things, and a time when Konami wasn't horrible. And sometimes you need that.